Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we've discontinued our in-person events and instituted online webinars. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Today, we have a distinguished panel of speakers who will be talking about the developing face of imperialism today as seen in the Global South. For some time, the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, were seen or thought they might be a counterweight to the power of the wealthy North. Has it turned out that way, or are they kind of sub-imperial powers? We have that and a number of other important issues to discuss, including a breaking issue. Today, the World Trade Organization is discussing the request of several countries in the Global South for a moratorium on the intellectual property rights of pharmaceutical companies to the COVID vaccines. A desperate need to increase the supply and availability for poorer countries of the Global South. So that and many other issues will be discussed by our speakers. Patrick Bond is a leading authority on the political economy of Africa. He's professor of government at the University of the Western Cape, South Africa, and honorary professor of geography at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He's the author of Looting Africa, along with many other publications. Ana Garcia is assistant professor at the International Relations Institute of the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Along with Patrick, she has edited BRICS, an anti-capitalist critique. And our third speaker is David Barkan, distinguished professor at Metropolitan Autonomous University, Xochimilco, in the city of Mexico. His latest book is De la Protesta a la Propista, 50 años imaginado y construyendo el futuro. Pardon my Spanish pronunciation. But we have three key countries of the Global South represented by our panel today. We'll go first with Ana Garcia from Brazil, followed by Patrick Bond representing South Africa, and David Barkan representing Mexico. So take it away, Ana.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm Ana Garcia. I want to, first of all, thank very much Cliff and also David for organizing this, and Patrick for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here I apologize, English is not my mother language. I speak Portuguese, Spanish too, a little bit of German because I lived in Germany for a period, but I'll try to make myself understandable. It's an honor to be here in such a specific and horrible situation of the COVID pandemic, which we face in Brazil. We have a joke here in Brazil that we face the pandemonio, which is the pandemic and the demonio of Jair Bolsonaro in power. So we face a fascist government, a fascist leader with this terrible situation of this health crisis. And we are lucky in Brazil that we have a very widespread health system. Despite the neoliberal period, despite neoliberal governments, this has not been privatized. So the United Health System in Brazil has really saved a lot of lives despite over 250,000 deaths in Brazil so far. So that's the scenario that we are in right now. It's not good news, but still it's possible to reflect and to think and to connect with you, which is great. So thank you so much. I want to, the start of our meeting today was the article that I've published with Patrick and a colleague Miguel Borba in Global Politics around BRICS, imperialism, and the Biden government. So I will just go a little bit into the subject of BRICS and where we stand today, beginning with the very reflection, the very question of what does it mean to be anti-imperialist today? What is anti-imperialism for us in Brazil, in Latin America, and what are the many types of imperialism that we face and how to struggle against it? And this is very interesting because the left, particularly the left in Brazil, but I think in other places too, South Africa is another example, see the BRICS, used to see the BRICS, but keeps on seeing China specifically as a counter-hegemonic force against the US, as a sort of anti-imperial power to face the US power over peripheral countries such as ours. This is very deep, very, very rooted, I would say, in the imaginary of the left in Brazil and in South Africa to a great extent. That's why I think this question is important, because anti-imperialism means most of the time for the left being anti-US, US interaction, US multinationals, US banks, etc. But is that is true? Of course. But is that enough? Can we fight imperialism fighting the US, or do we need to look to other actors, countries, multinationals, banks, financial flows, and also internal enemies such as our bourgeoisies as well? So that's the point that I want to start making. And then I want to go very quickly back to the context where me and Patrick first met not so long ago as Patrick and David and Cliff. It was around 2013, 14. At that time, just to make a context, I was an activist and a militant in the anti-mining movement. I still am, but at that time we were facing the Brazilian giant mining company Vale in Latin America and in Africa. I was for a few times in Mozambique, connecting with movements there, fighting against Vale. I was in Canada when the steelworkers striked against Vale. So it was this context of Brazilian multinationals going abroad in Latin America, and in Africa, and also in North America. And what does it mean, specifically under the Lula government, to have a Brazilian multinational so powerful and so big and extracting value from the workforce of in other countries? That was our main issues. And this time, when me and Patrick first met, was a time when BRICS was really held as a counter-hegemonic group. It was in the in the aftermath of the financial crisis, so after 2008, 2009, BRICS started to meet as a political group. Now it's been around 10 years, and BRICS became a sort of image of a counter-hegemonic pole, particularly China, but they were so-called emerging economies from the global south, without the interference of the US or Europe, building new financial institutions such as the New Development Bank. We were together in the BRICS summit in Fortaleza, me and Patrick. And the main ideas, the main concepts around there were development, sovereignty, autonomy as a counterpole to dependency, South-South relations being held as solidarity, horizontal relations. That was a big debate. Maybe in North America that was not so clear to you, but that was very strong in Brazil, in South Africa, in Latin America in general. And this coincided with the period of the so-called pink tide, of the progressive, more or less progressive governments in South America, some of them more socialist, such as in Venezuela, Bolivia, others less. But it was a coincidence of periods that the rise of BRICS and the Latin American pink tide were together figuring as this kind of counter-hegemonic political groups, which would be able to really be an alternative to the US. And this came to a point, and this was very strong to us, that in the coup d'etat against the PT government, in particular Dilma Rousseff in Brazil in 2016, the left in Brazil, like the landless movements and others, they were holding the idea that the coup was because of BRICS, because Dilma was aligned with China, was aligned with BRICS, because Dilma built a new development bank. The US didn't like it, so the US supported the coup against the PT. And this is, that has a part of truth, of course. I'm not saying the US did not interfere in Brazilian politics in that time, it did. But I do not think it is true to just think and to say that the coup d'etat in Brazil was because BRICS was so important. It was against the US. So this is, this is, again, deeply rooted in the imaginary of development, of being developed, of being modern, of being an emerging country, of being something important in the world order, so to say. And me and Patrick, we have been discussing BRICS around at least 3 different layers of analysis. So how to look and how to analyze BRICS. So you can look at BRICS as many of my comrades in the left normally look. So you look from above to the BRICS and you see BRICS governments and BRICS corporations, being somehow in a coalition against multinational corporations from the north, doing some coalitions without the countries from the north. So they try to gain power, military, economic power against Europe, against the US. So it's a sort of, from the geopolitical perspective, very common look to the BRICS as a counterpole from above, states and corporations against traditional Western powers. You can also look to the BRICS from the same level, so to say, so from a horizontal level, and then you can see the differences that you have between the BRICS, among them. So you see China really detaching from the BRICS, being a force, a big economic power within the BRICS, exploring Brazil, exploring South Africa and other countries in the global South, in Latin America, and in Africa. And you see then the convergences, but you see a lot of differences between the BRICS. And these differences, I sustain, they are greater now than they have ever been. So the differences and tensions within the BRICS today. And then you can see BRICS, and we call this BRICS from below. And there's 2 ways to see BRICS in this BRICS from below perspective. One is to look at the differences and inequalities within and between the countries. so that you see new hierarchies, new power relations within the global South. And then you see also class struggles and struggles from below, struggles in the territories against BRICS projects, against BRICS corporations, in mining, in oil, in agriculture, in infrastructure projects, etc. So there are these at least 3 or 4 different perspectives to analyze and to see the BRICS. And that's why I think it's important to be clear, because a great part of the left still see the BRICS from this geopolitical, from above perspective. And that's why many of them still sustain China and some of them even China as a socialist counterpole to the US and to the Western powers in general. What are the balance that we can take today, or the present situation? First, it's undeniable that BRICS has caused some tensions with the US. That's clear. Patrick will bring a little bit of the WTO situation that is clear in the intellectual property right issues. Of course, there are some tensions in the geopolitical perspectives, for instance, with Russia in the energy sectors, with China in some other sectors. There's, of course, this trade and technology tensions with the US. You see, of course, also tensions from within the international institutions, such as the IMF or the World Bank. But as Patrick used to analyze, it's very important, the reform that the IMF made in 2015 that did alter a little bit the codes of some of the BRICS to voting power, the codes that we have within the fund, did not alter at all the US situation, the US position within the IMF. But I would go further and say that the BRICS rise within the IMF did not alter the norms and rules whatsoever that the IMF has used to deal with other developing countries. So that when the US and when the IMF lent to Argentina 2 years ago, it did not alter at all the conditions of this lending, the norms and rules with which the IMF dealt with Argentina, with Angola 3 or 4 years ago. So the BRICS rise within Bretton Woods institution, within the existing institutions, despite the tension that it caused before that, did not alter the structures of those institutions that we normally call imperialist institutions. There are more bargaining powers for the countries in the South, of course, when one has the options to take money and credit from China or from the IMF or from the US or others. Of course, that makes a difference, but it does not alter the structure, the overall structure of these institutions. The NDB was a big issue. I won't be able to go into it, but the New Development Bank, which is interesting because despite the tensions, the growing tensions within the BRICS group, they still keep negotiating, they still keep their institution, which is the New Development Bank. It has as prior sectors of lending, infrastructure and energy, which, as we all know here in the global South, is on the one hand necessary, on the other has many impacts over environment, over local communities, indigenous communities, etc., familiar agriculture, etc. So it's not always good for the development of the countries. It has also very negative impacts. But beyond that, the NDB has made many projects together with the World Bank, such as also the Asian Infrastructure Investment Infrastructure Bank, which is a bank led by China. It has major participation of the BRICS and other countries in the South. So they have made many different infrastructure projects together with Bretton Woods institution, which really shows that the NDB is not able to be a clear alternative. To go further, I don't know how much time I still have. This article, how much time do I still have? How many minutes?
Take a few more minutes. Yes,
Okay.
go right
so
ahead.
Rush so that I won't take too long. The article that we published in Global Politics shows a little bit of my research that I've been doing for years now on South-South investments and investments agreements and the flows of credit, trade, and investments from BRICS countries, individual BRICS countries, to Latin America and Africa, which also shows that not less, they are less an alternative and more new expropriations and new cycles of accumulations. Mainly, they go to extractive industries, extractive sectors, and infrastructure. So from India, from China, from Russia, and from Brazil. South Africa is a little less in Latin America, but a lot in Africa. So what it shows in the end is a reproduction of accumulations, cycles of accumulation and expropriations within the global South. The situation today, so just quickly to this, that I see for BRICS and the limitations of BRICS as an anti-hegemonic group is, first of all, the detachment of China from the rest of the group. It's clear, and it's economically, politically, military, and the asymmetries between China and the other BRICS countries. Brazil, as you all know, is now under a total different political and economic situation than before. We face a proto-fascist government, clearly more military than before, and clearly closer, or wanna be closer to the US than before. We face a far-right India government. On the other hand, you do have maybe a potential stronger coalition between Russia and China, but deeper and deeper tensions between Russia and India, and also US and China rivalry, the EU and Russia tensions around energy, etc. And the situation of South Africa, Patrick will speak more, but it's a deeper dependence on foreign help, on foreign cooperation, and deeper dependence on China. But of course, there are other things to talk about, the limitations that BRICS have on being an alternative in Latin America specifically. But on the other hand, the support that Russia and China gave to Venezuela plays an important role. So you see the contradiction of BRICS in the case of Latin America very, very clear. What is limited, though, is how it works for the working classes in these countries, and not only against Western powers, and particularly the US. So just quickly to this question, what does it mean to be anti-imperialist today? What is anti-imperialist struggle today? And I want to go back to this developmentalist imaginary in the so-called national project. I've been in a lot of discussions with many comrades and colleagues in the left in Brazil on the main topic today, which is China. And they always go back, which is true, and I agree with them, to the question of the absence of a national project. So if China comes to us and lends us money and brings the Chinese multinationals to explore mining, energy, oil, it's not China's fault. It's not China as an enemy, as David just said. It's our failure not to have an autonomous, independent national project. And this is true, of course, but it brings back to the issue that dates from the post-war period in Brazil and in Latin America, which means that anti-imperialism means a developmentalist national project which presupposes a class alliance, which is a class alliance with a supposed national bourgeoisie. This was the very tactic of the Communist Party in Brazil and in many other Latin American countries in the 1950s, which was to say, we need a bourgeois revolution before we go to socialism. So we need to, for that, have an alliance with our national bourgeoisie to face imperialist integration, to face the US multinationals, to face the imperialist subordinated integration into the world economy. And after that, we can have an autonomous socialist revolution. So any so-called national based project with a somehow found national bourgeoisie, which I contest, would have the potential to be anti-imperialist. And this puts China, of course, in a very unique perspective, because a integration with China in the value chains that China poses us, which is the export of primary products, mainly agribusiness products and mining products, would have the potential to be an alliance against traditional imperialism, which is US imperialism. And this fails to see and to understand imperialism within capitalism and to place anti-imperialist struggles as also anti-capitalist struggles, which means struggles from below, struggles from the working classes in their many different phases, in the territories, indigenous struggles, women's struggles, environmental struggles, and workers' struggles. So I want to wrap up with this idea that brings us back to Rui Mauro Marini, because Marini was one in the 1960s, in his article in 65, who already responded and faced this idea of a national bourgeois working class coalition against US imperialism as being a false solution that would not lead to socialism, because industrialization depended in the value chains would not suppress, would not go over development. So the ECLAC solution, the nationalist solution, would not lead to socialism. And Marini, maybe you know him from Mexico, was in exile in Mexico and Chile, and then back in Mexico, he was a militant struggle in the anti-military dictatorship movements in Latin America and South America and in Mexico. He was already in that period facing this very tactic of the Communist Party in that period of equally anti-imperialism to anti-US struggle, which was not enough, right? So I will stop here and maybe have time to discuss it later. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Anna. Very interesting, and I'm sure that some of the points you've raised will be taken up by our other speakers. But let's go on now to Patrick Bond and give you the floor, Patrick.
Thanks, dear comrades. You know, in South Africa, where I'm in Johannesburg, the meeting where activists and scholars are mixed is to put us in our place as the petty bourgeois academics by saying amandla, power, away to the people. So we know actually we have to serve the people, and that's exactly where Anna left off, where a theorist of Marxism rooted in struggles, Rui Mauro Marini, gave way to, I think, from the 70s, a world systems theory. And then what I would argue, an advance on that, uneven development. So very quickly to theorize, very much in the spirit of Anna. I don't disagree with a single point she's made. And to lead to David, who's got such great classical Marxist background, let me try to just locate, and I'll do it personally, biographically, where if Cliff Durand remembers a world systems school at Johns Hopkins University, because Cliff and I go back to the early 80s, and I moved to Baltimore to study guitar initially at Peabody. And then I went to Johns Hopkins, and two of my teachers I'd like to mention. One, Chris Chase-Dunn, we've been in continual discussion with. He's, after Hopkins, moved to Riverside or Irvine, Riverside. And his work in California continues where he was trained, the world systems theory, which located, just as Anna said, a layer. I mean, Anna didn't go into all the details of Marini's discussion of Brazil as a sort of deputy sheriff, as a crucial nation in the expansion of US imperialism in the 60s and 70s. But the critical thing that, in debate with Andre Gunder Frank, the question of whether you could be a middle layer, a semi-peripheral country, and then graduate up the chain, say like Korea, maybe some of the other newly industrializing countries, or get pushed back down, or play some relationship in hostility to US imperialism, Iran, for example, in contrast to other more loyal allies from that layer, that semi-peripheral layer, like Israel or Saudi Arabia, Turkey being a floater. Do you see the point? The world systems didn't really have, at that level, a core argument about the logic of the layer we're talking about, this kind of global south middle layer. So hence semi-periphery. And I think from, again, Cliff will remember in Baltimore, Neil Smith with the theory of uneven development, and David Harvey, who was my PhD supervisor, picking up a general Marxist theory that the tendency in the system is to overaccumulate and find a spatial fix. Now, as that happened in the 70s, initially, if you were in Baltimore, Cliff, you would say, well, where did our manufacturing go? It went to North Carolina, it went to Alabama. Well, then it went to the maquiladoras, and then it went to China, maybe via the newly industrializing country. So the spatial spread of capital, a spatial fix, a geographical relocation, then allowed surpluses to begin to accumulate. And in some of these sites, that in turn created capitalist crisis conditions, which then in turn required them to find spatial fixes. And that is some contextual background that David Harvey gives for the word subimperialism. So the imperial project, and we go back maybe to Rosa Luxemburg's understanding of capitalist versus the non-capitalist, is this sort of central part of the process. Just over 100 years ago, 1913, she wrote The Accumulation of Capital. Somewhat different story than Lenin, Bukharin, Hilferding, who had a sort of inter-imperial rivalry at the core between capital and its states and its colonies on the one hand, and others on the other, and for Luxemburg, capital, non-capitalist, but still driving from the overaccumulation of capital, the need to take overproductive capital, excessive financial accumulation, and move it. Now, the BRICS come up just at the point, 2009, when the North's financial system goes into crisis. And hence, theoretically, even though Harvey was writing about subimperialism and about this layer, as early as his book, The New Imperialism in 2003. And in that moment, he could identify these crisis tendencies, again, as Rosa Luxemburg did, as being central to the way the global system would play out with a new imperialism. This was a debate, by the way, at the time, 20 years ago, with people like Michael Hart and Tony Negri, who would deny some of these economic logics in favor of various other framings of it. And there are other subsequent arguments. I think of, say, Tony Smith, or various ways to interpret imperialism today as super exploitative. None of these are all that contradictory. The real contradiction is exactly what Anna said, is that we can find in our left comrades, and I would say third worldist comrades, and I would sometimes say comrades who are citing the primary contradiction as imperialism and third world states. That is, it's a great tradition of anti-imperialist states. And, we had with Cuba, where Cliff and I spent some time in 2003, just such an exemplary case of a very consistent moral and economic sovereignty being expressed by Castro over all those decades. So we have such attraction to that, but the warnings that Ana Garcia just provided are so clear. And if I give you maybe just two examples in some depth about this, one would be climate, and the other would be COVID-19. And COVID-19 is critical because today there's a WTO meeting. It's going on tomorrow. And we'll be terribly disappointed for reasons I'll tell you. But even more dangerous over the long term is the arrangement between the Western imperial powers and the BRICS countries to establish a global climate regime that serves both interests. That is accumulation during an overaccumulation crisis, excessive desires now to move the capital, China using a Belt and Road Initiative, finding conflicts all along the pathway. Already, I think Anna has mentioned China, India being a site where just last June, fisticuffs led to dozens, some say scores of deaths of the Chinese and Indian soldiers as they threw each other literally off the cliffs of the Himalayas into freezing waters. They're not allowed to use guns in that particular border area. Or even maybe more explosive over the medium term would be the Kashmir conflict, in which driving right through from Western China to the Ghadar port in Pakistan, China would want to take that part of Kashmir, claimed by Kashmiris as their own nation, claimed partly by Pakistan, partly by India, and hence an extraordinary mess, and one that meant that Narendra Modi, the nationalist Indian leader, wouldn't even join the Belt and Road Initiative, and was very hesitant even to go to the BRICS meetings. For example, the BRICS meeting in 2017 in Xiamen, he threatened to boycott it until the last moment, because of similar fisticuffs in another part in Bhutan of the border area of Doklam. Now, what that means is you've got some, let's call them, sub-imperial rivalries, such as what I've just mentioned, but we've never seen them more acute than the WTO. In contrast, let me begin though with the climate agreements, and those are essentially to continue under the rubric of a Paris Climate Accord, to continue relatively business as usual emissions with gimmicks. Gimmicks that allow, for example, both the Chinese government for 2060 to be net zero and the Biden administration to make a similar claim for 2050, net zero emissions, which means a great many scams are going to be activated. And the one that I watched the most closely, which is most advanced in Europe and in California and in 5 major Chinese megalopolises, is called carbon trading or emissions trading or cap and trade. And it's in that sense of trying to solve the climate crisis by giving the crisis to the bankers that you get the essence of a sort of imperial, sub-imperial agreement. And that agreement found expression in one place in particular. It was Copenhagen in 2009, just after Barack Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize. He made a trip from Oslo down to Copenhagen. And then because the National Security Agency was actually bugging all of the negotiators, the opposing negotiators, as Edward Snowden then revealed, then what Biden and his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, could do was hone in on the room, a smallish room, where 4 major sub-imperial powers were discussing their climate policy interests. And those were led by Wen Jiabao, the Chinese leader, and Manmohan Singh from India, and Lula from Brazil, and South Africa's leader, Jacob Zuma. And this is in December 2009. And at that meeting, Barack Obama barged in. And what they did in that short space of time was what Bill McKibben, 350.org founder, said, I think very presciently. He said, this is a league of polluters and super polluters and wannabe super polluters. And what they did, they got together and they blew up the UN, just out those 5 countries. And the 4 are called the basic: Brazil, South Africa, India, China, and the US. So they set the tone for all future global climate politics, critically saying you don't have to be in a Paris Climate Agreement 2015 and mean it. You can just drop out and there's no punishment. It's voluntary. They even used the phrase bottom up. Now, why is that important? They could slap each other on the back, as Naomi Klein put it, and say, well, here's the deal. It's a Copenhagen Accord. You pollute and I pollute, and it's a deal. And it's voluntary, it's non-binding. The emissions ambitions are very, very weak. You can all sign up and it doesn't really mean anything. And then if you don't sign up, as Julian Assange with WikiLeaks using Chelsea Manning's State Department cable leaks, just fantastic material, as they showed, what Todd Stern, the main State Department negotiator, he went all around and just bullied everybody, bullied and bribed and cajoled into signing the Copenhagen Accord. Why that's important is because one of those BRICS, well, Russia wasn't there, but they were happy to be part of this because it didn't mean anything. But one of them, South Africa, then hosted 2 years later the same climate summit. Now, this is terribly important because we're just learning now of just how damaging the Paris Climate Agreement is, partly because just this week, they've done a sort of an assessment of the national determined contributions of the commitments. And it's a disaster, right? It's 3 degrees easily by the turn of the century with no real prospect of forcing the ambition up and the emissions down. But it's not only that. What we learned from the period, especially because, again, whoever Lucifer 2.0 was that leaked Hillary Clinton's emails, we saw Todd Stern coming in after the Durban, that was 2011, bragging that they got in the US everything they want, working closely with the South Africans. What did they want? Well, they didn't want any historic climate debt. They didn't want any sense that the responsibility, what we would call polluter pays, for the liabilities of the damage being done to the world by the climate, the emitters. They didn't want that in any of these UNFCCC agreements. And in the Paris Climate Agreement, they even put a special rider saying, if you sign this agreement, you acknowledge there's no liability, that the North didn't really pollute, that this historic climate catastrophe that's built up because of Northern emissions didn't happen. We're just starting at scratch, basically. And we will have a green climate fund. It's got a few billion, but the old promise from the Copenhagen Accord that there'd be $100 billion a year was missing, just gone. There are plenty of other things missing, like there's no military, there's no maritime, there's no aircraft, whether passengers or cargo. There's no sense of a just transition where labor, community, environment, and governments can shut down dirty carbon-intensive industries and keep those workers' jobs so that they're part of the solution. I could go on and on. There's so many mix for offsets and carbon trading, net zero, scamming. So we're going to be watching a lot of the so-called false solutions that especially Joe Biden and John Kerry have announced. So I did a piece in Counterpunch exactly a month ago and a few other sites just explaining where some of these politricks of Biden and Kerry can be expected. What's critical is that they have allies in the semi-peripheral, in the high-polluting countries. There are so many other ways to describe what's happening in these sub-imperial countries using this Marxian framework, like Marini and David Harvey, maybe the world system's subject to debate because it's more of a fluid system. But if I turn finally to the last case, which is underway, and it's the most important in the short term, isn't it? It's getting vaccines and treatment and the medical equipment required so that we can defeat COVID-19. And today, the struggle is over whether there should be intellectual property rights for big pharma corps that are guaranteed under the World Trade Organization's TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property system. And that's something that's been developed, as I'm sure everyone in the room knows. The US, as it seized physical production and turned the factory over to East Asia, kept the royalties and intellectual property monopoly ownership of the ideas and the research and development. So that meant for several decades that they built up this big law of intellectual property, which means if you are a big pharma corp, you really have a very strong interest in not sharing, in not taking the innovations, mainly state subsidized, society subsidized, that made for example, an Operation Warp Speed, vast amounts of money going to, the likes of Pfizer, which actually said it didn't, but I mean, it's had decades of this subsidization, or Moderna, or J&J, or in Britain, AstraZeneca working with Oxford, and all of the others. We could add, Sputnik in Russia, and Sinovac, and the other various vaccines coming up. I think, Cuba would be the great example. Cliff, you can help us on that, of trying to develop a vaccine that wouldn't carry intellectual property. And this is what's being discussed under a brand new WTO Director General who just took office today. Her name is Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. She was the Nigerian finance minister. She was considered an extreme neoliberal and created sort of IMF riots, especially in January 2012, that nearly overthrew the government. Before that, she did 25 years at the World Bank. And she was particularly the choice of South Africa as a sort of African and very eloquent, very suave African woman who could relate to the base. And in the discussions we've just seen coming up in the parliament the last few days, South Africa's foreign minister, Naledi Pandor, had a very interesting discussion with the sort of lead strategist of US imperialism today, right? The US Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. And Anthony Blinken was persuaded, according to Naledi Pandor bragging in our parliament last week, to then support Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala as the head of the WTO. And this is critical. It might be inside baseball or too much detail, but I think it's critical because the left, just like the hope for the BRICS that Anna described, had really thought that maybe Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala would today actually support the side of 100 and some countries, led ironically by South Africa and India, with Kenya, Swaziland, plus a variety of others signing on, to demand a waiver on intellectual property so that we can get the vaccines and especially some of these medicines and medical equipment on a non-branded and a generic basis. Now, why is that important? Just 10 seconds on our history. It's that the history of fighting AIDS in this country, especially where at the time, 20 years ago, there were 5 million people living with HIV, and they desperately needed these antiretrovirals, ARVs, these medicines, to strengthen their immune system. And the dilemma was that the pharmaceutical corporations had these monopolies, and they charged $10,000 a year. So a tiny fraction, mainly wealthy white men, could get the ARVs here in South Africa. And then in 1998, a treatment action campaign arose, and they fought very effectively against their own government. We can go into the details about Thabo Mbeki, the AIDS denialist, but particularly against TRIPS, against having these branded medicines put onto these monopoly sort of intellectual property platforms, which meant you couldn't get them for generics at an affordable price. And by fighting, and at the time Robert Zoellick was the US trade rep, the Minister of Trade, and he had to concede, well, he needed anthrax antidote from Bayer on a generic basis after the attacks in September 2001. Those were the little envelopes that went to Senator Tom Daschle and Tom Brokaw, the TV, sort of presenter. And when that happened, the activists outside and the health ministers inside said, Robert Zoellick, you better surrender your stance that makes you very, strongly in favor of big New Jersey pharmaceutical companies, Merck and GlaxoSmithKline, demanding that they continue to have extremely predatory prices on their medicines. And that force, that pressure, that extraordinary upsurge of anger around the world that the US would continue while there was this AIDS pandemic led to the exemption. Now that meant we got generic medicines in this country, and millions of 7 million or so at the moment are getting these through the public system. The life expectancy as a result of these free medicines, not $10,000 a year, free, has gone from a low of 52 to today 65. I've given that detail simply because it's exactly what we need to have happen with the WTO and TRIPS exemptions, waiver on intellectual property. Why isn't it? Well, let me just give you as a closing point, the bad boys. Well, they are Joe Biden, Bojo, Boris Johnson, the whole group in Europe, Brussels. And there's a fourth one who's most annoying. I think Ana Garcia knows his name well, Jair Bolsonaro. So you get Biden and Bojo and Brussels and Bolsonaro, and then you've got an imperial and slightly sub-imperial alignment against this waiver. I would add another character, Justin Trudeau, who is kind of a bit of a charlatan, a blackface comedian, and doesn't care much about Africa, apparently, and mediocre leaders from the likes of Japan and Australia and other sites where they're supporting intellectual property. Now, on the other side is a confusion. I mean, in between is China and Russia. And on the other side today and tomorrow, you'll find India, because it's the pharmacy of the third world, especially with CIPLA and the Serum Institute, and South Africa. But the South Africans are very indicative, and I'll close with this. This is the moment where you would expect the South African president, who last night addressed us all to tell us all that we are fighting in WTO to get more vaccines, because we've only had about 20 or 30,000 given so far. We just started a week and a half ago. And the prices and the South African variant of COVID-19 make this, tricky. And so what we really need is a generalized sharing of knowledge of all of these pharmaceutical companies and governments and Oxford and all of the people sort of commenting the knowledge. The internet does that. Our Center for Global Justice is commenting this knowledge right now. And I think that's where I'll end. That is the challenge for the socialist, for the feminist, for the ecologists, for the anti-racist and anti-imperialists, for all of you, those who care about climate and health and equity in the world economy. It's to find some sort of relationship that allows us to fight as hard as we can where we need to. Anna fighting Bolsonaro, us often fighting the Ramaphosa regime, but happy that South Africa is leading with India this struggle to get the waiver. And it puts us into what Marini, I think, Anna, you can confirm, is a theoretical core of the imperial sub-imperial relationship, an antagonistic cooperation. Because everything Anna said about the way the BRICS talk left but walk right in finance, she mentioned the BRICS New Development Bank. She could have mentioned the contingent reserve arrangement, which was supposedly an alternative IMF. We desperately needed it last year. It never appeared. It's dead. It's nothing. Or the way in the IMF and the World Bank, the BRICS basically play business as usual. They don't even challenge the leadership anymore, right? They don't even try to get the next president. Last time it was a Trump appointee, a real farcical character called David Malpass. They didn't even try to challenge his presidency. Or a European who's now the head of the European Central Bank, but her name, Christine Lagarde, and she was actually convicted for corruption in the case of Bernard Tapie from Adidas bribing the French Conservative Party. And yet the BRICS all supported her reappointment as the head of the IMF a few years ago. This is the kind of, let's call it a sort of subservient deputy sheriff role, in which instead of being an alternative, we are struggling, as Anna said, as BRICS from below, because we see the BRICS, the basic countries, these Bolsonaro, maybe even China and Russia in the WTO, actually not simply as repressive internally, but as amplifying global imperialism, not an alternative, but an amplifier. Let me turn it over to David to see if he has anything further on this question.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. Yeah, and maybe David can tell us what Mexico's position is on the waiver of the patent rights of pharmaceuticals on the vaccines. But David, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm a little overwhelmed. There's, in some ways, way Anna and Patrick have laid it out, there's little room to squirm, so to speak. But the struggles within each one of our countries are all very different, and yet part of the same process. And that's the extraordinary characteristic of when we get together from 3 different continents, when we get together from 3 different intellectual and historical traditions. One of the things that is quite striking is how much in common we have about our understanding of what's going on. I would like to start, though, by a concern, a different kind of concern. And that is not as historical as Patrick moved us, but the concern of the new Biden administration for America is back. Perhaps that is a very, very extraordinarily dangerous, worrying expression. I would like, given the fact that so much of the audience of this webinar is in the United States or has ties to the United States, I would ask you, and I would ask us to reflect on how extraordinarily worrying that is, not just for the health of each one of the struggles that Anna talked about, that Pat has talked about, but the actual health of the globe as a whole. Because America is back meant that the United States sent airplanes to bomb last week a new community. And it said it was in retaliation for killing a US contractor who was not even who was in a city that he shouldn't have even been in. The notion that the United States is once again the world's policeman is very troubling. What does that mean? The United States is back. Does it mean once again that we will impose, the United States will impose a breakup, a destruction of an extraordinarily progressive regime like was the case in Libya? What will it mean about the embargo against Cuba? Pat mentioned, but didn't perhaps make importance. Cuba is developing its own vaccine right now, but not only is it developing its own vaccine, it's showing its ability to produce literally tens of millions of doses of this vaccine, and begin to think it's doing the third stage tests right now within the country, but is talking about how to make it available in countries all over the world. Cuba's health system represents an extraordinarily different paradigm of what healthcare should be and could be. But America's back again doesn't mean that the United States will reduce its war, its low intensity, I think that's what they call it, low intensity war against Venezuela. It does not mean that the United States will stop intervening in the elections in Central America. It does not mean anything except perhaps an intensification of the possibility of a different kind of approachment to a hot war on an international basis. Make America great again is, I think, going to remain an old-fashioned slogan compared to America is back. And that is particularly troubling. What is the war? What is the Cold War like? What does the notion of the United States reassuming the role of the world's policeman, that should be, I think, an extraordinarily troubling development. And I would urge the people in this audience who are from the United States, who are still US citizens, to think about what it means in terms of your own participation in politics, in terms of what does it mean in terms of struggling, the real everyday struggles about reasserting the private enterprise control of the energy system. What does it mean about all of the kind of internal struggles, but also what does it mean about supporting Jair Bolsonaro. Even today, Monday, March 1st, the president of Mexico had a discussion, well, I still don't know what the content of it was, had a private telephone conversation, or not so private, telephone conversation with Joe Biden. And perhaps some of you, the audience actually knows what occurred there. But the question that Cliff, you raised when introducing me is a number one question. Mexico in the United Nations has the pretty face of saying our country wants to promote COVAX, wants to promote the generalized circulation of the vaccine throughout the whole world, and especially to the deprived nations. But COVAX doesn't deal with the problem of intellectual property rights. The only way that you're really going to popularize, democratize the availability of the vaccine is to take away the property rights, is to allow the generalized production of the vaccine in installations all over the world. And that isn't being discussed as a progressive alternative, is not yet being discussed as the only really viable alternative to the COVAX approach. The fight against intellectual property rights is an extraordinarily important one, but it's going to take a long time. The example that we had in Africa of a few years ago is a very, very important one, is a precedent. South Africa was able to really wield great power there. But I don't think that there's a real understanding in the BRICS nations, I don't think in the imperial nations, of how extraordinarily dangerous it is that there are going to be centers of population, very, very important centers of population around the world that will not be vaccinated, that will not get the kind of protection that the wealthy countries are getting. And as long as there are centers of population that are not being protected, the whole world is at risk. And that is what the new Cold War is about. But the new Cold War is about not simply stopping the local wars, but the new Cold War is an absolute lack of understanding of the vulnerability of the leading imperial countries to the debilities, to the holes within the system in any part of the world. We can talk about, and we should be talking about, the extraordinary struggle that will take place in the World Trade Organization tomorrow. A very, very important struggle. But it seems to be a foregone conclusion that intellectual property rights will be defended. The question is, how is the world productive system, all globally and in every region, being reorganized by capital to enable or to disable the ability of people to feed themselves? How is the world productive system still being organized or reorganized to prevent the possibility of really attacking climate change? How is the spread of capital and the notion of technological fixes that will not address the underlying problems of environmental change, of climate change, of global warming, how is that going to affect the survivability of the planet as a whole? The wealthy people, the wealthy groups within the United States, the wealthy group globally, are at this moment on a course of increasing the danger of new pandemics, of greater environmental disorganization, and of a greater polarization on a world scale. I would like to shorten my intervention because we're already way beyond, and it's always interesting in this seminar to hear the kinds of questions and interventions. I would like to end by saying, by repeating, America is back is far more dangerous than Make America Great Again. The world, the Cold War, and the probability of new local hot wars all over the world to prevent movements of global justice, of local justice, the notion of the using of various kinds of economic blockades, the notion of preventing, as has happened, the International Monetary Fund from using the special drawing rights to at least empower economically the poorest countries in the world from buying the vaccines, even if there are intellectual properties, while the intellectual property rights remain. The wielding of the power of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the use of the World Bank projects to continue to permit and intensify the existing infrastructure developments, which are accelerating the process of a different kind of an integration which holds no hope for the welfare of the majority of the people of the world, is perhaps the greatest danger in the world at the present time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. All right, now we turn to our audience, those who are attending, who have questions or comments they want to share, and hopefully we can have some dialogue. Let me say a word about how we will handle the questioning, because some people are watching this on YouTube and they don't have any direct way of presenting a question. So if you are on YouTube and want to contact us with question or comment, send it in an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I will monitor that and pass your question on to the participants. On the other hand, those of you who are in this Zoom room with us, and there are about 15 here right now, you can ask your question directly. And you do that by turning on your video. I will put everybody on gallery view so I can see everyone. And you put your, turn your video on and wave. And when I see you waving at me, then I can call on you and you can unmute yourself and speak. I see we have a number of people here. Harry Targ, who's a foreign relations specialist, Purdue University. Michael Leibowitz, who economist, who's been in, both of them have been in previous speakers in previous webinars, and I'm sure they will have something to say. So, who has the first question? Well, Harry put a question in the chat box. Why don't you speak it yourself? Harry?
Oh, hi. Briefly, what I wrote, and that's enough to world history is dialectical. I always like to think of the forces stimulating global hegemony and resistance, and the outcome is the combination of the two. Could the panelists talk about the state of resistance today, whether we think of the progressive international, global anti-capitalist movements, cross-national labor movements, anti-racist campaigns that take a cross-national character? What's the condition of global solidarity and resistance today? And I'd be interested in the panelists' response.
All right, who wants to take that on first?
Well, I'll begin. From a Mexican and a Latin American perspective, I think it's interesting that today, in these days, the president of Argentina is here in Mexico with the president of Mexico. Both of these men are trying to deal with a history of 30, 40, or even more years of neoliberal manipulation, of neoliberal conditioning of developments in their country. Both of them are trying to mobilize popular support and are facing extraordinary pressures from the international community to block, to put a brake on what's going on in their countries. Both of them, however, are also working very hard to provide a basis for international solidarity within Latin America. And we have two examples of that, two recent examples of that, which are important. One, the overcoming by the Bolivian progressive, the Movimiento al Socialismo, the ability of the Bolivian Movimiento al Socialismo to retake power against an extraordinarily peculiar, what some people call soft coup, against Evo Morales in 2018, I think it was, or 19. And both of those, both Mexico, Fernandez and Lopez Obrador, the president of Mexico, played an important role in providing the kind of backstopping that was necessary for the initial transition and the consolidation of the ability of the MAS to retake control in Bolivia. And it's very exciting to see the kinds of developments that have been taking place in Bolivia since then. And so I think that your question, Harry, is very, very important in that context. We also have the context right now of Ecuador, where an election will take place next month on a second round of voting. And it's likely that the progressive candidate will take over there and will be able to reverse, hopefully, a history of terrible administration by the present Ecuadorian regime, which has given in completely to the IMF. Fernandez himself in Ecuador is facing a tremendous problem because the IMF set up an absolutely impossible debt structure that would prostrate the Argentine regime if it were to honor all of the obligations that the Macri regime before it had set up. And it looks like the IMF is going to be obliged to go back on that procedure and give in and allow a new kind of arrangement so the Argentine government can try to implement some of its best policies. It's very, very interesting also to see what is going on with Venezuela. As many of you know, perhaps some of you have felt it in your personally, there's a huge natural gas problem because of the storms and because of the environmental problems in Texas. One of the first moves as a result of that crisis was that Mexico was deprived of a very, very important part of its gas supplies. The first regime, the first reaction, international reaction to Mexico's problem was from the Maduro regime in Venezuela to immediately offer gas supplies to supply the problems, the supply problems that were caused in Mexico by that event. This kind of solidarity, of international collaboration, it is not probably getting a lot of publicity in the United States. This kind of international arrangements among progressive regimes is very, very important. I think that if we're talking about resistance, we also have to understand that the very fact that Cuba is moving on the path that it's moving on and has announced publicly that new visitors, new tourist visitors to Cuba will also be eligible for the vaccine is also an extraordinary illustration of the kind of popular and political solidarity that a different kind of vision of what public health is, a different vision of what international solidarity means, can be developing. I think that in spite of your quite correct political evaluation of the Canadian Prime Minister at this moment, Patrick, I think that it's very, very important to understand that the First Nations within Canada are also extraordinarily effective at this moment in organizing themselves, not simply as individual ethnic groups, but in creating a national organization which is going far beyond the original Idle No More movement to redefine the way in which they're going to negotiate with the Trudeau regime about the access to their natural resources. And even within the United States, we've had the first moves by the new upcoming Secretary of the Interior, an indigenous person, to look at the way in which access to native lands will be changed over the course of the next few years. So Harry, when you're asking us to talk about resistance, I think we have to understand that there are many different levels of resistance. Here in Mexico, we're in a disastrous situation with regard to internal politics because our president has a peculiar notion of what development is. And although he says he's anti-neoliberal, there are many of us who are asking about what's the difference between a new refinery, what's the difference of a major infrastructure project that's going straight through Mayan lands? What's the difference about creating a land-based Panama Canal, a land-based interocean transport system? So we have lots of internal conflicts and internal contradictions But we really have to understand the world is more complex than that. And we really have to celebrate the centers of international solidarity that are developing throughout Latin America. I can't talk about Africa. Thank you very much.
Okay, Patrick, Anna, you want to say anything about resistance?
Anna, you go first.
Should I go first? Thanks again for being here and for being able to participate in this conversation. I talk from a complex situation from a country where we had the World Social Forum 20 years ago and the major resistance against neoliberalism with the election of Lula in 2002, a little bit before, of course, Chavez in Venezuela, but then after Lula, we had the election of left governments in the region. And now we are in the very, very opposite side for several reasons. And there are many roots to the situation that we are in now. But the fact is that it's very hard to struggle and to build resistance right now in the situation that we are in Brazil specifically. The traditional left-wing organizations that we call the redemocratization movements, which is the building of the landless movement and the Central Union movement of the CUT, both of which built the PT, the Workers' Party, built the base for it. They are very weak, and after the coup d'etat in 2016, very behind, even though they're strong in the debates, behind in concrete territorial struggle. What I mean with territorial struggles are really occupations, street demonstrations, street mobilizations, and other sorts of mobilizations. I would point to at least two issues. One is the heterogeneity of social movements linked to, I would say, identities. Anti-racist movements, feminist movements, and indigenous movements. They're very heterogenic in Latin America in general, in Brazil in particularly, but I would say they are, except for the indigenous movement in Brazil, which is very weak, but very strong in other countries, the feminist and anti-racist movements, they're getting stronger and stronger. I think that the Chile feminist movement really gave a huge example to feminist movements all around the world and in Latin America specifically the year before. And then the Black Lives Matter movement also gave rise to many anti-racist movements in the streets despite the pandemic also here. But they still haven't developed a strategy towards the state. And that is missing, and that is important. That is essential, I would say. And adding to this, we have ever also stronger urban movements, urban occupation movements, so that we had in the last election, in the case of Brazil, which is the city, the municipal election, a huge and strong and left candidate in the city of São Paulo coming out of the urban struggles, the urban occupation struggles, which is important. But again, they are very heterogeneous and they still need to develop a strategy towards the state, which they don't still have. And I think it's a problem. And they've been
And maybe if Anna has just temporarily disconnected, I could pick up very, very similar sorts of thinking. Anna, if you're hearing us, come back, maybe reboot, put you back in the discussion. I would simply say that the South African left and the resistance that Harry's interested in, and we're all wanting to promote, isn't that much different than what Anna was describing as fragmented and let's say, atomized kinds of sectoral work, we would say, sort of in the silo. But there are some very interesting periods ahead of, in fact, even this week on Wednesday, the finance minister, a man called Tito Mboweni, the name Tito is absolutely irreconcilable with his very strong neoliberal political perspective. But Tito Mboweni presented a budget with terrific cuts that I've never seen in my 31 years living here. That is, say, 12% over the next 3 years in the health budget during this pandemic. And so as the, even the small, the tokenistic cash grant payment that goes to about 18 million of the 60 million South Africans every month, even though that was even shrunk, and a small, again, very tokenistic, far less than Bolsonaro did in Brazil, a sort of monthly emergency grant has run out. And as the lockdown last year and the 7.2% crash in GDP led to 1.4 million job losses, what I've been able to pick up, and it's mainly through connecting to the South African Federation of Trade Unions, SAFTU, second biggest federation, or the biggest union movement is, the union is called NUMSA. We're not getting Anna back yet. Anyway, we'll keep an ear open for her. And it does seem that there was a unified critique that came from the center left and the left forces against this extreme neoliberal reaction. Now, the budget deficit went up to about 14% of GDP. Our public debt's in the sort of 82% range. The credit rating agencies junked us completely last year. So we are in a sort of situation, even an IMF loan, $4.3 billion last year, of what I would suspect will be an uptick of struggle. Reactions often to austerity, including, oh, Anna's back, that's great. I'll finish my thought, Anna, then you pick up the story again, just kind of reiterating the same story you were describing in Brazil here in South Africa, but without too much immediate prospect for unifying these forces. And I just add as another point that the African continent as a whole looks rather like this. Atomized protests, sometimes mass uprisings. It was 10 years ago, last month, that the, it was January of 2011, that the Tunisians overthrew the Ben Ali regime with a kind of similar IMF riot feeling, but well grounded in progressive democratic organizations after the self-immolation of a young man harassed as part of effectively what the IMF was doing was clamping down on the informal sector, putting a value-added tax. His name, Mohamed Bouazizi, so he's seen as the spark for that North African uprising, which then went to Egypt. And not all of those went well. Egypt, certainly not. Libya, a catastrophe. But throughout the African continent in the 2010s, one uprising after the other. And it was like a wave. It was a tremendous, like a kind of prairie fire going through. So it went to, for example, Uganda, where people were protesting by walking to work together, which was banned. It went to Kenya, to Zimbabwe. Throughout in South Africa, very effective protests that are usually context specific to get free tertiary education, university education, fees must fall, to get free water and electricity in sites where urban struggles have been heightened, to get the free AIDS medicines that I was describing earlier. And it just seems to me that's the difficult thing, where we've got atomistic and sometimes very successful protests. To unify these, I would just recall for you Samir Amin's argument. He died 2.5 years ago, but left us with, Harry, you were asking, is it a progressive international, a fifth international? So Samir Amin really wanted to see that sort of global South-led movement of workers, peasants, communities, environmentalists, feminists, intellectuals. So that was, in a sense, something we've tried to pick up in various debates. How do we keep Samir Amin's vision alive? And part of it is indeed cohering around national economic strategies. And for him, the word delinking continued to come up again and again. I would add that his delinking was rooted in the Marxist theory of a value transfer. And as I talked to him repeatedly in his last year in 2018. He then augmented that, and he did it actually at several points in his career, with the sense of the natural value, so an equal ecological exchange as part of this argument for the delinking. So I think that's actually where many of these national struggles will cohere in their national forms and making demands for the kinds of localization and reindustrialization. But I'll go back to Anna, because what she said initially was critical. You don't really have any anticipation in these contexts across the African continent, as Frans Fanon told us, of a national bourgeoisie that is patriotic, that really is grounded. It's going to have to be much more rich, much more than the kind of communist formula of a two-stage theory. And that would lead me to just those last two words that I started with, amandla, a power, aware to the people. That's where it's going to come from. Anna, you probably get the last words because I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, just quickly to finalize what I was going to say, I think that the situation in Ecuador kind of reflects the spectrum of the left in general. But just to go back to where I was, the examples of Chile, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Argentina with the anti-abortion law, I think they're really strong, and they are inspirations to us in Brazil now in our situation. But let's not forget that the far right, the super conservative far right, linked to Pentecostal churches and linked to US-based far right, they are all over Latin America. They're not only in Brazil. We've been researching their connections around the continent, and that's something that we need to fight as well. I think the Ecuador situation reflects the different spectrums of the left. So you have the more developmentalist left around Korea's candidate. You have the very neoliberal around, I forgot his name, candidate. And then you have the indigenous candidate who sometimes is also ambiguous, but is anti-developmentalist. So it's more or less like this that we have the scenario in other countries as well. And just one final word, I think we need to look closer to this mass of workers without rights who are now working in apps, delivery apps, Uber apps. These are the new kinds of workers that we need to get closer to and to organize. There was very, very interesting, a strike, a one-day strike of the delivery apps in Brazil in May. And there's an anti-fascist delivery app movement, which is, of course, not very big, but it's very active. And there's a really great leader of them who is well politically educated, and they are totally without rights. They're app workers, digital workers. And I think that we need to look closer to them to build the connections, because they are really all over the world.
Yeah, Anna, you had raised the question of a national developmental project being needed in order to counter imperialism. But of course, what we see, as Patrick was just suggesting, is the national bourgeoisies are are hardly patriotic. In fact, wasn't it Andre Gunder Frank who called them pseudo bourgeoisies? They're not really.
Even better, lumpen, the lumpen bourgeoisie.
Lumpen,
yeah.
that was his term, right? And I wonder if in this era of transnational capital having such dominance over the economies of countries north and south, whether any kind of national-based resistance can be effective, even with a national project.
I'd like to put in a word here, because I think that perhaps one of the real questions that we have to confront each one of our countries and on a world scale is whether national resistance is the best way to go at this particular moment, or whether it's not more suitable to look at the regional struggles for autonomy and independence within the nation state that are looking to reclaim large areas, large parts of territories, and to develop alternative strategies of production, of social organization, and of alliances among themselves. I want to mention, for example, and it's striking in the context of Harry's question. I didn't mention, but I think it has to be mentioned, the Zapatista movement. The Zapatista movement is, we really have to understand. We had a seminar about that. What was it, at the beginning of February, Cliff?
Yes.
The Zapatista movement represents a territory which is large as the country in Europe called Holland, then the Netherlands. I think that that's very, very important. It's a country, it's an area which is bringing together perhaps as many as 500,000 people. And then in closer to Mexico City, there's another movement which has 200,000 people and has 45 years of organization as an autonomous governing regional basis with an extraordinary, deep and profound ability to support local community organizations within other parts of the country. As I said in my original comments, there is this international organization which is organized, which is in 80 countries and which occupies a quarter of the world's land surface. And they're organized in a set of regional and international networks that involve local organization, local production, and the development of alternative productive strategies. And another very, very important organization in terms of resistance and internal organizing, which augurs well for what you're talking about, Harry, is the Via Campesina, a group that has 200 million people associated in 81 countries. But the most important thing about the Via Campesina is it's not just an organization of indigenous and peasant cultivators. It has a strategy for providing an alternative to the world agro-food system. And that seems to me to be an important part of the issue of what is resistance about. In Mexico, people don't think about it. Even you, Cliff, in your wonderful center in San Miguel Allende, perhaps don't realize the significance of the fact that there are 25 million members of the National Indigenous Congress, and those communities have claims to 1/3 of Mexico's national territory. I could go on about how that works. These are not communities that have one power. These are not communities that are that are openly talking about an alternative yet. But these are communities that are definitely talking about how do I de-link? And I think that that's a very, very important question. How do I de-link? And to what extent can I de-link from the international market? To what extent can I develop alliances, regional and national and international alliances, which allow us to thrive on our strategies of improving local well-being, and taking care of the environment. This is, when I mentioned what's going on in Canada, this is exactly what this new organization proposes explicitly. And I think that we have to understand that there are two levels on which we have to struggle. The kind of thing, the marvelous kinds of descriptions that Anna is giving about what's going on among the people she's associated with and she's describing, I think we have to celebrate that. But we also have to celebrate and understand the potential for community organizations to create a basis for further autonomic movements on a local, on a regional basis, not a community by community, because all of these groups understand that you can't work on a community basis. The organization I talk about that's 40 years old, 200,000 people strong, has 43 different cooperatives that are members. All of them are indigenous and most of them bilingual or trilingual. And it's really quite extraordinary how they have been working to stop the advance of hydroelectric projects, stop the advance of high voltage energy lines, to provide an alternative basis, because they are very much conditioned with providing local sustenance and full employment within their regions. So, Harry, getting back to your question, there are different kinds of resistance movements. I would argue that we cannot ignore the national resistance movements and the kinds of things that are happening in your country, the kinds of things that are happening in the United States are very, very important on a national basis. But we really have to understand the significance and the scope of local, regional movements that are creating alliances on a global basis.
Are there others who want to weigh in on this question of resistance? Or are we ready to move on to other questions? Does anyone else have a question? I didn't get any in the email box, but I see that a couple people who were on YouTube have moved over into the Zoom room, and so maybe did that in order to ask a question.
I have a question, Cliff.
Oh, Bob, turn your camera on.
I wish I could.
Down in the left-hand corner, you'll see a little image of the a video camera with a red line through it, meaning that it's crossed, that is shut off. You just click on it, and you'll activate your camera, and we can see you. But in any case, we can hear you.
I'll be brief.
What's your question, Bob?
I without displacing or any of these suggestions, by the way, this is one of the best reports I've ever heard, Cliff. Thank you for your leadership and organizing of it. I wanted to thank David for his wonderful emphasis, but I want to also add the dimension of global resistance at the scale of global oppression. And the only organization I know that is mounting such an effort is Progressive International. I don't see that this is a source of diversion or detour, but a source of solidarity and strength, not only of indigenous struggles, but also of the industrial working class. Indigenous struggles and the industrial working class have not succeeded in making their peace with each other here in Mexico. I regret, to my very deep sorrow, Uh, but this vision is held by Progressive International. A call to action has been made by it based on the founding meeting in 2018 between Varoufakis and Bernie. And it seems to me that we all should ponder and join this global dialogue over where we want to come down and what our programs really should be. It's a place for dialogue on the left that is open and available, very transparent procedures. So I just wanted to put that in the mix. Others can speak on the matter or not.
Now, does anyone wish to say anything about the Progressive International? Lauren Langman, I see your hand. If you unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't want to speak on the definite issues. I'm not a Latin Americanist, although I once lived in Mexico, which is why I can fake my way through Spanish. I just want to make sort of two comments that are general that, you know, we live in very, very difficult times, as everyone knows. But I just got through with my International Sociological Association meeting. And for the people that know me, already know it. For the others, a good chunk of my work is social movements, beginning with global justice movements. And then I had to switch over with the election of Trump, Bolsonaro, Orban to the global injustice movements. But one of the points I just want to make that should give everybody a note of hope is the tremendous flourishing of a large number of youth movements. And I don't think we can possibly underestimate the importance of youth. Now, most of these things are not going to be covered much outside a local newspaper, if at all. But if you do the social movements, you begin to see it. And I think the thing that's kind of very important here that doesn't usually get mentioned except by people like me, that the extent to which these kids are so much more computer savvy than any of us old folks, and I'm going to say old is over 30, which gets everybody here, I think, maybe 40, 50, 60. Anyhow, the point is that one of the things that does happen is that these kids, sometimes they're in high school and they're protesting against the cutbacks of the schools, as for example, I've seen this in Brazil. But they're on the internet and they're going to be in touch with the kids in Hong Kong that are protesting the People's Republic. And so I do think whether or not it's going to take place in terms of a clear-cut international, as some of us would like to think, but we are beginning to see this tremendous change in youth. At the same time, whatever else the COVID has done is, as I've often said, and I don't claim to be original, it's sort of like Toto, the dog ripping apart the curtain and showing the Wizard of Oz. What COVID has shown is the complete and total utter failure of neoliberalism in a number of ways. And most of these kids, most of these young kids, they've not even, studied philosophy or sociology, but they know that neoliberalism is not only fucking them over, but they're screwed the rest of their lives, which is one of the reasons why we're getting this tremendous upsurge of young people voting. And just the final comment, when I was last at a BLM march in Chicago, I couldn't believe it. I mean, BLM had one day 25 million Americans were protesting. But one of the things that was so profound for me is in so many of these groups, it was more white kids than black kids protesting racial injustice, police brutality. And so, yes, we still have the problem of organizing, but getting these kids together. But these are our hope. And so I really do think that, we will be seeing at some point either a cinder block of what was left of the earth or a global socialist society. That's the good news. The bad news, some of us aren't going to live to see it, but we got to keep hoping.
I'd like to react to this because another resistance movement that we haven't talked about, Lauren, what you were talking about is very, very important. And I think we have to celebrate that. But there's another element which it's really extraordinary how it manages to fly under the radar for so many people at a webinar like that. And that is the global environmental justice movement. There is a marvelous initiative, which is now more than 20 years old, called the Environmental Justice Atlas, EJ Atlas. There, anybody can look at with that in your browser. Its initiative started in Barcelona under the aegis of a good friend of many of us called Joan Martinez Aller, who should be really greatly celebrated for not only asking hundreds of students and collaborators to describe what's going on in each one of the environmental conflicts, but more importantly, bringing them together so that we can understand that there is a network of destruction, there is an organized process of capitalist wanton travesties around the world, and the terrible thing about it is the EJ Atlas at this point has about 3,500 case studies documented, mapped, photographed, and with first-person analyses of the resistance process. The EJ Atlas, it is not an answer to how to reconstruct the world, but it is an answer to the understanding of the profound knowledge that people around the world have about how to begin to organize and what we should be doing as an alternative to simply saying the way in which to go is via the ballot box. It is no longer sufficient. Democracy, representative democracy, is arteriosclerosis. How do you say that? It's sclerotic. Representative democracy isn't going to do the kind of things where you get the 25 million people that Lauren talked about the Black Lives Matter. And the 3,500 case studies that are documented in this EJ Atlas are just perhaps only the tip of the iceberg, because every time I move more than 5 kilometers, I find a new case study which has to be included in the process. But the exciting thing about this is that many of these cases are now promoting an alternative way of organizing their spaces, of getting rid of the transgressors, yes, but it's not enough to just get rid of the transgressors. We have to move beyond that to reorganize space and the relationship of people to space.
Bahram, did I see your hand raised? Or were you just stretching? All
No,
right.
I was just stretching, but Cliff, good to see you again. I've seen you in San Miguel.
Yes, yes. Okay, we need to wrap this up. We're running late. Any last comments that any of our speakers want to add before we sign off?
I want to say something. Ana Garcia's participation in the seminar has been an extraordinarily important contribution to our understanding of the variety and creativity of the events that are going on in her country and what she's involved in. Ana, te mando un beso, te mando un abrazo, y te mando agradecimiento.
Muchas gracias. I want to maybe just to wrap up, I have to leave because my kids is coming from school. I have to pick him up. Just very quickly to the point, I completely agree with the need to internationally connect among struggles. There's no question about it. One just needs to remember our very important struggle against the FTAA a decade ago. against the free trade area of the Americas, which was, I think, a great example of how to connect around the continent and among different organizations which are very different in nature, such as unions and environmental movements or women's movements. So I think the FTAA still is an example for many of us who lived in that period, but I don't think that we can leave out the struggles towards our own national states. Otherwise, the international connections will be very weak. And this is something that really worries me about some of the movements around identities, such as racial identity, gender identity. I think that we need to have, first of all, we need to have strong organizations with strong class conscience. Otherwise, corporations will capture, and they are already doing this. For the racial struggle already in Brazil, which is something out of it, for the feminist struggles, they've been capturing this for many years already. The other issue is that I do think that the so-called national development project that I mentioned before, as an answer of many of us in the left and many of the developmentalist left to the relations with China, to say we do not need to leave China just because they exploit our mine and our oil. We have to have our own national project in order to deal with China at the same level. This has been, to many of the cases, the very project of the pink tide before. They did have a national project to put the money, the revenue out of extractive industry in social areas, in social sectors, but they did not necessarily, at least not all of them, connect with grassroots populations, with grassroots organizations, with communities, with indigenous communities, with people living out of fishing, living in the countryside, in the hinterlands. And for the case of Brazil, I must say this was essential. This came out in the context of the coup against the PT, the far right coup against the PT, backed by the US, etc., etc. But without the stronger connection with social organizations, the PT was left mostly alone. The working class in Brazil, without jobs, being precarious, without social services, they voted for the far right. So we do need to develop a national developmental project, but grassrooted, based on the working classes, and building strong and conscious working class organizations, not to run in the same areas that the PT had. That's what I want to finish with. Thank you so much again for being here. It was really great.
Thank you, Anna, so much. Patrick, final word from you?
Yes, very, very quick. I just reiterate the point that today and tomorrow we have an opportunity to actually put into practice more of these pressure points. And it may be that I disagree with my old compañero David about, for example, whether global governance institutions should be legitimized and strengthened. The one that I'd worry about the most, David, I'm sure you'd agree, the IMF, and whether special drawing rights enhancements, which, as we saw from Dominic Strauss-Kahn's exercise in the same efforts in 2009, 10, 11, did provide, as you suggested, some funds to poor countries. But they mainly empowered the Western countries. They're the ones who had the vast majority of SDRs, and the QE and SDR, that whole expansion led to asset inflation and much more inequality and a simple displacement, not resolution of the capitalist crisis. So I would differ from, very good comrades like Jayati Ghosh from India, who's a very strong proponent of the SDRs, and say, no, that's actually not the way. And one of the things we can do tomorrow at the WTO is maintain the traditions of delegitimizing illegitimate global leaders. Now, the big one will be Glasgow for the COP26, right, the climate summit. But what I see really on the agenda tomorrow, and I hope those of you in the US are paying attention, please watch Amy Goodman's Democracy Now!, Nermeen Sheikh as well, interviewing a US Congresswoman and a South African representative last Thursday about this, about whether we can take something that's critical, that is the commons, knowledge, pharmaceutical information that can save lives, to take it out of the commodity form and out of the WTO by delegitimization of WTO and of intellectual property. That's the big agenda, where I don't necessarily see some of the social democratic groups around the world. I mean, you know, Progressive International may be an exception. I don't know their story on this, but it would really be a question of whether we somehow think there's some global Keynesianism, a global Keynesian, you know, Green New Deal of some sort, which I think is just a fantasy, or whether instead we take these kinds of opportunities, as we have tomorrow in the WTO in Geneva, to weaken the power of global capital and the interstate system that supports it. That's my 2 cents. But again, Amandla Awatu, thanks for being with us, dear comrades.
Well, thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
And it's really great to see you again after so many years, and hope our paths will cross again before long. Anna, thank you again for your contribution. And David, we had a really marvelous panel here, very informative. And I'm sure that our audience all found it very enlightening. Today's webinar, by the way, will be available on our YouTube channel, as our past programs are. You access them through our website, globaljusticecenter.org. And there's lots of good material there, I'm sure that you'll find most interesting. Next Monday, I hope you will join us for our next Global Justice webinar, Between Classes, the Rise and Fall and Rebirth of the Labor Intellectual Alliance. Historian Steve Frazier will be our speaker, and I think that you'll find this very fascinating, as well as other programs coming up this month. March is Women's History Month, and we have a series of 3 programs coming up in March, co-sponsored with Sarah Mohair, on various issues affecting women, not only in Mexico, but globally as well. So visit us again next Monday, and then following Mondays, we'll be here at 1 o'clock Mexico time. Hope to see you then. And for now, then, this is Cliff Durand signing off.
That could
And if anyone wants to stay around for a while to chat, we don't have to